It was the summer of 2013 when my uncle, his best friend Carlos, and I decided to take a trip deep into the forests of southern Brazil. I had just turned 19 and was thrilled about the idea of spending time with them. My uncle, Roberto, was the adventurous type, always talking about the remote places he and Carlos had explored over the years. They both loved the outdoors, and this time, they invited me along to a secluded cabin they had rented for a week. The cabin was about a 5-hour drive from the nearest town, tucked away in a dense forest that stretched for miles. The plan was to unwind, fish, and hike during the day, and sit around a fire at night. I was eager to escape the city for a while, even if I had a nagging feeling about being so far from civilization. The drive itself was an adventure. We passed through winding roads, thick patches of jungle, and occasional glimpses of wildlife darting across the dirt paths. By the time we reached the cabin, it was late afternoon. The structure was rustic but solid, made of weathered wood, with a wide porch that overlooked a small clearing. Surrounding it was nothing but an endless sea of green. Roberto and Carlos unpacked the truck while I took a look around. The air was humid and filled with the buzzing of insects and the distant calls of birds. There was no cell service, of course, but that was expected. The cabin had basic supplies: a wood stove, a small generator for light, and enough food and water for the week. We spent the first evening settling in. After a simple dinner, we sat outside under the stars, the thick canopy above us only allowing slivers of moonlight to pierce through. The forest was alive with sounds, a mix of chirping, rustling, and occasional howls in the distance. The next day, we decided to explore the area. Roberto mentioned a nearby stream that was supposed to be great for fishing. We grabbed our gear and headed out early, following a barely visible trail that wound its way through the trees. It was easy to lose track of time out there. The dense vegetation and towering trees made the forest feel endless. The stream turned out to be as beautiful as Roberto had described. The water was crystal clear, running over smooth rocks and surrounded by ferns and moss-covered logs. We spent hours fishing and talking about nothing in particular. It felt peaceful, almost surreal, being so far removed from everything. By late afternoon, we decided to head back to the cabin. That's when things started to feel off. The first thing we noticed was the silence. The usual hum of the forest had died down, leaving an eerie stillness. Even the birds seemed to have disappeared. At first, we brushed it off, joking that maybe the wildlife was just taking a break. But as we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The trail back felt longer than it had in the morning. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing. The trees were so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. When we finally reached the cabin, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. But that relief didn't last long. That night, strange things began happening. It started with faint noises outside, like something moving through the underbrush. At first, we thought it might be an animal. Roberto and Carlos even joked about it, saying it was probably a curious jaguar or some other predator passing through. But the noises grew louder and closer, and they didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. Around midnight, we heard what sounded like footsteps on the porch. They were slow and deliberate, not the random scurrying of an animal. Roberto grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside to take a look, but there was nothing there. The rest of the night was tense. None of us slept much, and by morning we decided to investigate the area around the cabin. We found strange markings on the trees near the edge of the clearing. They looked like claw marks but were too uniform, almost like they had been made by a tool. Nearby, we also found what looked like a small, makeshift shelter made of branches and leaves. It was empty, but it didn't feel abandoned. Carlos suggested we might have stumbled into someone's territory, maybe illegal loggers or hunters. Roberto seemed to agree, but I could tell they were both uneasy. We decided to stay close to the cabin for the rest of the day and keep an eye out for anything unusual. That night, the noises returned, louder than before. This time, we could hear faint whispers, too, though we couldn't make out any words. It felt like they were coming from all around us, moving closer and then fading away. By the third day, we were on edge. We spent most of the day trying to figure out what to do. Leaving the cabin wasn't an option. We didn't want to risk getting lost in the forest, but staying didn't feel safe either. That evening, as the sun began to set, Roberto and Carlos decided to set up a perimeter around the cabin. They placed makeshift traps using fishing line and empty cans to alert us if anything approached. I stayed inside, feeling useless but too scared to venture out. As night fell, the atmosphere grew even more oppressive. The forest seemed darker, the shadows deeper. Around midnight, the traps started going off. First one, then another. We grabbed our flashlights and looked outside, but we couldn't see anything. The forest was still, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. The final night was the worst. Around 2 a.m., we heard heavy footsteps circling the cabin. They were deliberate, almost taunting. Then came the banging on the walls, loud and violent, as if something was trying to break in. Roberto and Carlos tried to keep me calm, but I could see the fear in their eyes. We huddled together, clutching whatever we could use as weapons: a hunting knife, a hatchet, even a heavy stick. The banging continued for what felt like hours, then suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. We stayed awake until dawn, too scared to move or even speak. When daylight finally came, we didn't waste any time. We packed up whatever we could carry and left the cabin behind. The trail back to the truck felt like it stretched forever, but we didn't stop. None of us said a word until we were back on the road, putting as much distance as possible between us and that place. To this day, I don't know what was out there. Maybe it was people, maybe it was something else. But I do know one thing: I'll never go back to that forest again. I've spent most of my adult life in the city, stuck in the endless loop of boardrooms, spreadsheets, and client calls. I'm a businessman, not the kind of person who knows much about forests or cabins. My life revolves around profits, projections, and contracts, but I've always believed in rewarding good work. A few weeks ago, my company landed a massive deal, and I decided to treat my employees to a weekend retreat, a way to let everyone relax before diving into the next big project. The location I chose was a remote cabin in the mountains. It wasn't too far from Denver, where my company is based, but still far enough to feel isolated. The cabin was surrounded by dense forest, with a few hiking trails nearby. I booked it online after reading glowing reviews about the serene environment and how it was perfect for team-building activities. It looked ideal on paper. I brought along 4 of my employees: Chris, Mike, Emily, and Sarah. They were some of the best workers in the company, and I thought this retreat would be a good chance for them to bond. Everyone was excited about the trip. We packed light, loaded up the SUV, and hit the road early on a Friday morning. By noon, we had reached the cabin. The place was exactly as described: wooden and rustic, with large windows that offered a stunning view of the surrounding forest. It had all the modern amenities we needed: a full kitchen, comfortable bedrooms, and even a fire pit outside. After unpacking, we spent the afternoon settling in and exploring the nearby trails. The forest felt alive. The towering pines swayed gently in the wind, and the air smelled fresh, like damp earth and pine needles. Birds chirped in the distance, and the occasional rustle of leaves hinted at small animals moving through the underbrush. It was peaceful, a welcome change from the constant noise of the city. That evening, we gathered around the fire pit, roasted marshmallows, and shared stories. Laughter echoed through the night as we joked about work and shared personal anecdotes. The stars above were brighter than I'd ever seen in the city. Felt like the perfect getaway. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to go for a short walk. The others were still asleep, so I quietly slipped out of the cabin. The forest looked different in the morning light, calm and inviting. I followed a narrow trail that seemed well-trodden but not marked. It was quiet, except for the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of leaves. After about 20 minutes, I noticed something strange. There was a clearing up ahead, and in the middle of it stood a small wooden structure, almost like a shed. It looked old, the wood weathered and gray, with moss growing along its base. I hadn't seen anything about this in the cabin's description or the online reviews. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached the structure. The door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. I peeked inside, expecting to see old tools or maybe hunting gear. Instead, there was nothing but an empty wooden floor. The walls were scratched as if someone or something had clawed at them repeatedly. Felt wrong, like I shouldn't be there. I decided to head back to the cabin. The walk back felt longer than it should have, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle in the bushes made me glance over my shoulder. By the time I reached the cabin, the others were awake and preparing breakfast. I didn't mention the shed. I didn't want to spook anyone or ruin the mood. The rest of the day went by uneventfully. We hiked a longer trail, took some photos, and spent the evening playing board games. But as the sun set, I couldn't stop thinking about the shed. Something about it felt off. That night, I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why at first, but then I heard it. A faint sound coming from outside. It was rhythmic, almost like tapping. I sat up in bed and listened closely. It was coming from the direction of the woods. My heart started racing. I got up and looked out the window. The forest was dark, but the moonlight illuminated the clearing around the cabin. I couldn't see anything unusual. The tapping continued, growing slightly louder. It wasn't coming from the cabin walls. It was deeper into the woods. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly stepped outside, making sure not to wake the others. The cold night air sent a shiver down my spine as I followed the sound. The tapping led me back toward the shed. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing the structure in the same eerie state I'd found it earlier. The door was still ajar, but this time I noticed fresh scratches on the wood, as if they had been made recently. The tapping had stopped. I stood there, frozen, trying to decide what to do. Then I heard it, a low, guttural sound, almost like breathing, coming from behind the shed. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement in the shadows. Fear took over, and I ran back to the cabin as fast as I could. I locked the door behind me and sat in the living room, trying to calm my racing heart. The forest outside was silent again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. The next morning, I told the group we were leaving early. I made up an excuse about an urgent work matter that required my attention. No one questioned it. They simply packed up their things and we left the cabin behind. I didn't tell them about the shed or what I'd heard. Even now, months later, I can't explain what happened. I've tried looking up information about the area, but there's nothing unusual about it. No reports of strange activity, no local legends, nothing. But every now and then, when I'm alone in my office late at night, I think about that shed. I think about the scratches, the breathing, and the feeling of being watched. And I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed a moment longer. It was the summer of 2014 when my cousin Ben invited me to join him at his remote cabin in northern Montana. Ben was a scientist, always tinkering with experiments and studying things I barely understood. He worked for some research firm, but he never talked much about it. The cabin was his escape from the city and the pressures of his job. It was tucked deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. The idea of getting away sounded good to me. I needed a break from my own routine. I was 28 at the time, working a boring office job in Denver. The idea of fresh air, quiet nights, and maybe even some fishing sounded perfect. Ben had called it rustic, but when I got there, it was clear he'd undersold just how isolated the place was. The dirt road leading to the cabin was barely passable, with overgrown brush scraping the sides of my car. By the time I pulled up to the clearing where the cabin sat, I was already second-guessing my decision. The cabin itself was small, built from rough-hewn logs, and surrounded by dense pine trees. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, and barely any electricity. Ben had installed some solar panels for basic lighting and to power his equipment, but the place was otherwise primitive. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. It felt like we were completely cut off from the rest of the world. Ben greeted me with his usual energy, a mix of enthusiasm and distraction. He was in his mid-30s with a wiry frame and a beard that made him look older than he was. He showed me around the cabin, pointing out the basics: the wood stove, the water pump, the outhouse a short walk away. He had a small lab set up in one corner of the cabin, with a desk covered in notebooks, laptops, and odd-looking equipment. "This is where I do my thinking," he said, though I noticed he avoided explaining exactly what he was working on. I didn't press him. Ben had always been a bit secretive about his projects. The first couple of days were peaceful. We spent the mornings hiking and the afternoons fishing in a nearby stream. Evenings were spent sitting by the fire, sharing stories and enjoying the quiet. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Ben was preoccupied. He spent long hours in his makeshift lab, scribbling notes and fiddling with strange devices. When I asked what he was working on, he brushed it off with vague answers like, "Just some data collection." One night, I woke up to a strange humming noise. It was faint but persistent, like a distant generator. At first, I thought it might be the wind, but the sound didn't change. I got out of bed and walked to the main room of the cabin, where I saw a faint glow coming from Ben's lab corner. He was hunched over his desk, completely absorbed in whatever he was doing. "Ben," I called softly, but he didn't respond. I didn't want to startle him, so I went back to bed, telling myself it was none of my business. The next day, I noticed something strange during our hike. The woods were eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush, just silence. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel like you were being watched. I mentioned it to Ben, but he dismissed it, saying, "The forest has its moods." His calmness didn't reassure me. That evening, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. There was a clearing about 100 yards away that seemed out of place. The grass was scorched in patches, and the soil felt loose and dry, as if something had disturbed it recently. I knelt down to examine the ground and found small metallic fragments scattered around. They were sharp and cold to the touch, unlike anything I'd seen before. When I showed them to Ben, his face went pale. He quickly took them from me and muttered something about scrap metal before pocketing them. His reaction only deepened my unease. What was he hiding? That night, the humming noise returned, louder this time. Couldn't ignore it. I got up and found Ben in the middle of the clearing, surrounded by strange equipment. He was wearing a headlamp and scribbling notes, his face a mix of concentration and anxiety. I stayed back, watching from the shadows, unsure of what to do. He seemed to be measuring something, using devices that beeped and whirred softly. The next day, I confronted him. "Ben, what's going on? What are you really doing out here?" He sighed and finally admitted that his work wasn't just data collection. He was studying unusual electromagnetic fields in the area. He claimed it was related to his research, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. He avoided eye contact and quickly changed the subject. The following night, things took a turn for the worse. The humming noise was now accompanied by a low vibration that shook the cabin. I could feel it in my chest, like a deep bass note. Ben was frantic, pacing back and forth, muttering to himself. He kept checking his equipment, his face pale and sweaty. Around midnight, the power went out. The cabin was plunged into darkness, except for the faint glow of Ben's equipment. The vibrations grew stronger, and I could hear faint clicking sounds coming from outside, like stones tapping together. I grabbed a flashlight and looked out the window but saw nothing. The forest was pitch black. Ben suddenly grabbed his gear and bolted out the door. I followed him, yelling for him to wait, but he was already in the clearing, setting up his devices. The clicking noises grew louder, echoing from all around us. I shined my flashlight into the trees, but the beam seemed to get swallowed by the darkness. Then, out of nowhere, a loud crack echoed through the clearing. One of Ben's devices exploded, sending shards of metal flying. I hit the ground, covering my head, and when I looked up, Ben was on his knees, staring at something in the distance. I followed his gaze and saw a faint, flickering light deep in the woods. It wasn't a campfire or a flashlight. It was something unnatural, pulsating and shifting like it was alive. Ben grabbed my arm and yelled, "We have to go!" We ran back to the cabin, slammed the door, and barricaded it with whatever we could find. The humming noise was now deafening, and the vibrations felt like they were going to tear the cabin apart. Ben was frantically packing his equipment, saying we needed to leave immediately. But before we could, the entire cabin shook violently, and the windows shattered. I ducked as glass rained down, and when I looked up, Ben was gone. The door was wide open, swinging on its hinges. I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside, calling his name. The clearing was empty, and the pulsating light was gone. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. I searched for hours but found no trace of him. It was like he had vanished into thin air. By morning, I was exhausted and terrified. I packed what little I could and drove away, leaving the cabin behind. To this day, I have no idea what happened to Ben or what he was really studying out there. Every now and then, I hear that faint humming noise in my dreams, and I wake up in a cold sweat. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. Whatever Ben uncovered in those woods, it was something we were never meant to understand. I was 31 when I decided to spend a weekend alone in a remote cabin deep in the woods of Vermont. It was late October of 2018, and I needed a break from the grind of city life. I wasn't trying to find myself or anything dramatic like that. I just wanted quiet. The cabin belonged to a friend of a friend. It was small, with a single bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a wood stove that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in decades. The area was far enough off the grid that there was no cell service, and the nearest town was a good 40-minute drive away. Perfect. When I arrived late Friday afternoon, the air was crisp, the sky a dull gray. The forest around the cabin felt dense and heavy, like it had been there forever, untouched by time. The trees were tall and close together, their bare branches clawing at the sky. The cabin itself was modest, nothing fancy. A wooden deck wrapped around the front, and the paint on the shutters was peeling. Inside, it smelled like damp wood and old books. I unpacked my things, lit the wood stove, and settled in with a beer and a book. That first night was uneventful. I heard the usual sounds you'd expect in the woods: branches cracking, leaves rustling. The occasional sound of an owl hooting broke the silence. I slept well, wrapped in a thick quilt I found in the closet. The next morning, I decided to explore the woods. I figured I'd hike a bit, get some fresh air, and maybe snap a few photos of the scenery. The trail behind the cabin wasn't well marked, but it was obvious enough to follow. The further I walked, the quieter it became. About an hour into my hike, I noticed a strange smell, something sour and metallic. I've been on enough hikes to recognize the smell of decay, but this was stronger than anything I'd ever encountered. It wasn't the faint, distant odor of a dead animal. This was something else. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether to keep going or turn back. But curiosity got the better of me. I pushed forward, stepping carefully over fallen branches and slippery moss-covered rocks. Then I saw it. The body was lying face down in a shallow ditch, partially covered by leaves. At first, I thought it was a mannequin, maybe some kind of morbid joke left by hunters or campers. But as I got closer, the smell hit me again, stronger this time, making my stomach turn. It was a man. His clothes were dirty and torn, and his skin had a sickly, bluish tint. I couldn't tell how long he'd been there, but it had to have been at least a few days. Flies buzzed around his head and hands, which were the only parts not covered by the leaves. I froze, my heart pounding. For a moment, I couldn't think or move. My brain was screaming at me to run, but my feet were glued to the ground. I stared at the body, trying to make sense of it. Who was he? How did he die? Eventually, I forced myself to turn away and head back to the cabin. My hands were shaking, and I felt like I might throw up. When I got back, I locked the door behind me and sat down at the kitchen table, trying to calm myself. I knew I should call the police, but I didn't have cell service. The nearest landline was in town, which meant I'd have to drive back. The idea of leaving the cabin didn't sit well with me, though. I felt exposed, like someone was watching me. As the day wore on, I tried to distract myself. I cleaned the cabin, chopped some firewood, and made a small dinner. But I couldn't stop thinking about the body. Who was he? Was his death an accident? Or was there something more sinister at play? That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every sound outside made me jump. The wind howling through the trees sounded almost human, like someone crying. Around midnight, I thought I heard footsteps outside the cabin. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The sound was faint but deliberate, crunching leaves and snapping twigs. Someone was out there. I grabbed the axe I'd used earlier to chop wood and crept to the window. The moonlight was faint, but I could make out the outline of the trees. I didn't see anyone, but the sounds continued, circling the cabin. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, the sounds had stopped, but the uneasy feeling remained. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things quickly and got in my car. As I drove down the dirt road leading away from the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The rearview mirror showed nothing but empty woods, but the feeling persisted. When I finally reached town, I called the police and told them about the body. They took my statement and said they'd send someone out to investigate. A few weeks later, I got a call from the sheriff's office. They'd identified the man as a local who'd been missing for about a month. The cause of death was unclear, but foul play wasn't ruled out. To this day, I don't know what happened in those woods or who was outside the cabin that night. All I know is that I'll never go back. Something about that place felt wrong, like the forest itself was hiding secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear those footsteps outside my window. I took the night shift at the ranger station out in the woods. The cabin, a small wooden structure with a tin roof, sat at the edge of a dense forest. It was 2018, late October, and the nights had grown colder. I was 29 at the time, trying to make ends meet while finishing school, and the job, though lonely, was easy money. All I had to do was monitor the weather, report any unusual activity, and ensure the trails were safe for hikers. That night, it had been raining for hours. Not a gentle drizzle, but a steady downpour that rattled the tin roof like a drumbeat. The sound of rain and wind filled the air, drowning out any other noise. The heater in the cabin hummed softly, barely keeping the chill at bay. I sat at the desk with a cup of coffee, staring at the radar on the outdated computer. The screen flickered now and then, and the Wi-Fi was spotty, but it was enough to check the weather and send updates back to the main office. The cabin was lit by a single overhead light, casting long shadows on the wooden walls. A small cot in the corner served as my bed, though I rarely slept during my shifts. Behind me, a large window overlooked the forest. Beyond the glass, the trees swayed in the wind, their silhouettes bending under the weight of the storm. It was close to midnight when the power flickered. The light dimmed and came back, then dimmed again. The storm must have been stronger than I thought. I reached for the flashlight on the desk, just in case, and continued monitoring the radar. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life. It was static at first, but then a faint voice came through. It wasn't from the main office, this was something else. I leaned closer, adjusting the volume, but the words were garbled. The voice stopped abruptly, replaced by silence. I brushed it off as interference from the storm and went back to my work. But the uneasy feeling lingered. At 12:30 a.m., I decided to step outside for a quick look around. I grabbed my raincoat and flashlight, pulling the hood tight over my head. The rain hit me like a wall as I stepped onto the porch. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the muddy trail leading into the woods. Everything seemed normal at first. The rain poured, the wind howled, and the trees groaned under the weight of the storm. But as I scanned the trail, I noticed something odd. About 50 yards away, there were footprints in the mud. At first, I thought they might belong to a hiker caught in the storm. But the longer I looked, the less sense it made. The prints were fresh, too fresh for someone to have passed without me noticing. And they were barefoot. Who walks barefoot in a storm like this? I felt a chill crawl up my spine that had nothing to do with the rain. I considered following the prints, but decided against it. If someone was out there, they wouldn't have gone far. And if they needed help, they'd come to the cabin eventually. I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. The heater was still running, and the familiar hum of the cabin felt like a small comfort. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hours dragged on. The rain didn't let up, and the power flickered a few more times. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the forest remained empty, at least as far as I could see. Around 3 a.m., I heard it. A knock at the door. It wasn't loud, just a single soft knock. I froze, my hand hovering over the flashlight. My mind raced. Could be a hiker, lost and seeking shelter. But why wouldn't they call out? The knock came again, this time a little louder. I stood, gripping the flashlight tightly, and moved toward the door. "Hello," I called out, immediately regretting it. My voice sounded too loud, too shaky. No response. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the door. Then I slowly reached for the handle. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned the knob and opened the door a crack. The porch was empty. The rain poured harder than ever, the wind whipping through the trees. I shone the flashlight around, but there was nothing, just the empty trail and the endless forest. I closed the door quickly, locking it again. My hands were shaking as I returned to the desk. I told myself it was the wind, that I'd imagined it. But deep down, I knew better. The rest of the night was a blur of unease. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, set my nerves on edge. I didn't step outside again. At dawn, the storm finally passed. The first light of day broke through the clouds, casting the forest in an eerie, gray glow. I packed up my things, eager to leave. As I stepped onto the porch, I froze. The footprints were back. This time, they led up to the cabin and stopped at the door. There was no sign of whoever or whatever had made them. But as I followed the trail with my eyes, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The footprints didn't lead away. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a solo trip deep into the woods. I was 27 at the time and had always enjoyed hiking and exploring remote places. There was something about being out there, away from the noise of the world, that made me feel alive. I had planned to camp for a few nights in a national forest a few hours from my small town in Michigan. I wasn't looking for anything luxurious or heavily traveled, just peace, quiet, and solitude. I parked my car at a trailhead that wasn't very well known. It wasn't marked on maps, but I had heard about it through a friend who enjoyed exploring off-grid places. The trail wasn't maintained, so I had to navigate carefully, keeping track of my bearings using a compass and a paper map. I had packed light, just the essentials: food, water, a tent, and a first aid kit. The hike was challenging but beautiful. The forest was dense, and the trees seemed to stretch endlessly toward the sky. The sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the ground. Birds chirped in the distance, and the occasional rustle of leaves hinted at small animals moving through the underbrush. After about 5 hours of hiking, I came across a small clearing. It was a perfect spot to set up camp, with just enough open space for my tent and a fire pit I could assemble. I dropped my pack and stretched, feeling the strain in my shoulders and legs. As I began unpacking, I noticed something odd on the far edge of the clearing. There was a faint trail, barely noticeable, leading deeper into the woods. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, overgrown with weeds and brush. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check it out before setting up camp. I grabbed a flashlight just in case and followed the trail. It was narrow and uneven, forcing me to step carefully. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. The birdsong faded, and even the wind seemed to die down. After walking for about 15 minutes, I stumbled upon something that immediately sent a chill down my spine. In the middle of the woods, there was an old, abandoned cabin. It looked like it had been there for decades, maybe longer. The wood was weathered and gray, with patches of moss clinging to the sides. The roof was partially caved in, and one of the windows was shattered, leaving jagged glass around the frame. There was no driveway, no path leading to it, just this forgotten structure hidden deep in the forest. Against my better judgment, I decided to get a closer look. The cabin didn't appear to have any recent signs of life. The door was slightly ajar, hanging crooked on its hinges. As I approached, the air seemed heavier, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking under my weight. Pushing the door open, I was hit by a musty smell of decay and dampness. The inside was dim, the light barely reaching through the broken windows. The cabin was small, just one main room and a smaller side room. The furniture was sparse. A rotting wooden table, a couple of chairs that looked like they would collapse if touched, and a rusty old stove in the corner. The walls were lined with shelves, but most of them were empty, except for a few dusty jars and a stack of yellowed papers. The side room had a bed frame, but the mattress was missing. The floorboards were warped, and in one corner, there was a dark stain that made my stomach turn. I tried to convince myself it was just water damage, but the color and shape didn't sit right with me. I felt an overwhelming sense of unease, like I was being watched. But every time I turned around, there was nothing there, just the silence of the cabin and the forest beyond. I decided to leave and head back to my campsite. As I turned to go, something caught my eye near the stove. There was a small metal box, partially hidden under a pile of debris. It looked like an old toolbox, the kind with a latch on the front. Against my better judgment, I picked it up and opened it. Inside were a few rusty tools, a pocket knife, and a small notebook. The notebook was battered and damp, the pages curling at the edges. I flipped it open and found scrawled handwriting, barely legible in places. Most of the entries were short, cryptic notes about hunting and trapping in the area. But as I read further, the tone changed. The later entries were frantic, almost nonsensical. They mentioned hearing things at night, seeing shadows that didn't belong, and feeling watched. The final entry sent a shiver down my spine. It's still out there, watching, waiting. I can't leave. If you find this, don't stay here. Don't let it follow you. I slammed the notebook shut and stuffed it back into the box. My instincts screamed at me to leave immediately. I hurried out of the cabin, barely pausing to glance back. The hike back to my campsite felt longer than it should have. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. I decided not to stay the night. Packing up my gear as quickly as possible, I strapped on my pack and started hiking back toward the trailhead. The forest was much darker now, and I relied on my flashlight to guide the way. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept hearing faint noises, a soft crunch of leaves, a twig snapping, even what sounded like faint breathing. I would stop and turn, shining my flashlight into the trees, but there was never anything there. After what felt like hours, I finally reached my car. I threw my pack in the back seat and jumped in, locking the doors behind me. My hands were shaking as I started the engine and pulled onto the gravel road leading back to the main highway. Even as I drove, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something lurking in the back seat. When I finally got home, I couldn't sleep. The cabin, the notebook, the noises in the woods, they all played over and over in my mind. A week later, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to do some research about the area. What I found chilled me to the core. There had been reports of people going missing near that stretch of forest over the past few decades. Hunters, hikers, even a few locals who knew the area well. Most of them were never found, and those who were discovered had no clear cause of death. I don't know what I stumbled across in that forest, and I don't think I ever want to find out. But sometimes, late at night, I still feel that same heavy silence, the same sense of being watched, and I wonder if somehow it did follow me after all. I woke up to the sound of rain tapping against the roof of the cabin. It was relentless, a steady downpour that made the forest outside seem even darker and more isolated than usual. The small cabin was tucked into the side of a mountain, surrounded by tall pines and jagged cliffs. I'd rented it for a weekend getaway, hoping to escape the stress of work and the noise of the city. It seemed perfect on the website, quiet, remote, and simple. Now it felt too remote. The cabin was small, just one main room with a kitchenette, a table, and a bed pushed against the wall. There was a fireplace, but it wasn't much help. The dampness seemed to seep into the walls no matter how much wood I burned. Outside the single window, the rain blurred everything into a smear of green and gray. I tried to distract myself with a book, but I couldn't focus. The rain wasn't just loud, it was oppressive. It drowned out everything else, muffling the world beyond the cabin. I couldn't hear the wind or the occasional bird calls I'd noticed yesterday. It was just rain, constant and heavy, making the forest feel like it was closing in on me. By mid-morning, the power flickered and went out. I wasn't surprised. The cabin relied on an old generator that had looked questionable when I arrived. I had a flashlight and some candles, so I wasn't completely in the dark, but it was unsettling. Without the hum of the fridge or the overhead light, the silence inside the cabin became deafening. I decided to make some coffee using the propane stove. The hiss of the burner was comforting in a strange way, a reminder of something familiar. As I waited for the water to boil, I glanced out the window again. The rain had eased up slightly, and I could see the forest more clearly. The trees were dripping, their branches weighed down by the water. A narrow trail led from the cabin into the woods, but it was muddy and slick. I told myself I'd take a short walk later if the rain stopped completely. Staying cooped up inside wasn't helping my nerves. But for now, I stayed put, sipping coffee and trying to convince myself that the isolation was what I'd wanted. Around noon, I heard it, a faint sound that didn't belong to the rhythm of the rain. It was a sharp, irregular crack, like a branch snapping. I froze, straining to listen. Came again, closer this time. My mind immediately jumped to animals. Maybe a deer or a bear. I'd read the safety pamphlet in the cabin, and it said to keep food sealed and avoid leaving anything outside that might attract wildlife. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the cabin door just enough to peek out. The rain had started again, though it was lighter now. I couldn't see anything unusual, just the trail and the wet trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I shut the door and locked it, feeling ridiculous for being so paranoid. It was probably nothing, maybe a branch falling under the weight of the rain. But the uneasy feeling stayed with me. By late afternoon, I was restless. The rain hadn't let up, and the light was fading fast. I decided to check around the cabin, just to ease my mind. I put on my rain jacket and boots and stepped outside. The air was cold and damp, and the rain soaked through my jacket almost immediately. I walked around the perimeter of the cabin, looking for anything unusual. The ground was muddy, and my boots sank with every step. Near the edge of the clearing, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. They weren't mine. These were fresh, pressed into the mud, and they led from the trail to the side of the cabin. They were boot prints too large to belong to me, and they stopped near the bedroom window. I stared at the prints, my heart pounding. Someone had been here. Maybe they still were. I turned and scanned the trees, but the forest was empty. The rain made it hard to see or hear anything, but I didn't want to stick around. I hurried back inside and locked the door, checking all the windows to make sure they were secure. My mind was racing. Who would be out here in this weather? The nearest town was miles away, and there were no other cabins nearby. I tried to think logically. Maybe it was a hiker who'd gotten lost and come to the cabin for shelter. But why didn't they knock? And why were the footprints by the window? The hours dragged by, and the rain didn't let up. I kept the flashlight close and sat by the fireplace, listening for any sound that might signal someone approaching. The cabin felt smaller and smaller, like the walls were closing in. It was just after midnight when I heard it again, that sharp crack of a branch. This time, it was followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and too heavy to be an animal. I grabbed the only thing that could serve as a weapon, a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, and stood near the door. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. The doorknob rattled softly at first, then harder. Whoever it was, they were trying to get in. "Leave," I whispered to myself, as if the intruder could hear me. The rattling stopped, but I didn't feel relieved. The silence was worse. I strained to hear, but the rain and my own heartbeat drowned out everything else. After what felt like an eternity, I heard footsteps again, moving away this time. I waited until they faded completely before I dared to move. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and exhaustion. I didn't sleep, I kept the fire going, the poker in my hand, and my eyes on the door. When the first light of dawn broke, I decided to leave. The rain had stopped, and the forest was eerily quiet. I packed my things quickly, threw them into the car, and drove down the muddy trail without looking back. The cabin owner called me a few days later to ask how my stay had been. I told them about the footprints and the attempted break-in. They seemed surprised but brushed it off, saying it was probably just a hunter passing through. But I knew better. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. They had been watching, waiting, and if I hadn't been inside with the door locked, I don't want to think about what might have happened. Now, every time it rains, I can't help but think of that night in the cabin. The sound of footsteps outside, the rattling doorknob, and the knowledge that, in the middle of nowhere, no one would have heard me scream.